Hello and welcome to another video from Bradley Siderograph. In this video, we're going to go over the 2014 turn dates. So for the Siderograph indicator, there are four primary turn dates for 2014. The first date took place in early February. When I talk about the turn dates, I want to point a couple things out. The first thing is that a turn in the Siderograph could indicate a turn in the stock market, both a top and a bottom. So for example, for the turn date in early February, you'll notice that the Siderograph made a top and the stock market made a bottom. It's important to remember that the Siderograph making a top, that could indicate either a top or a bottom in the stock market. So when you see a turn in the Siderograph, don't think so much in terms of the stock market following the Siderograph. Instead, look at it as turns in the Siderograph equating to turns in the stock market. So here's an example. Let's say that for the July 17th turn date, the stock market made a top and it was getting ready to turn to go down. If you go to the October date, that could indicate that the stock market could bottom out there and go up, even though this is a top. So just keep in mind that just because you see the Siderograph topping, that does not mean that the stock market will top. It could indicate a potential market turn, both a bottom and a top. So let's see how well the Siderograph has performed for 2014. If you look at the first major turn date in early February, you'll see that the stock market in the US, the S&P 500, bottomed out at approximately the same time as when the Siderograph topped. If you go farther out to the middle of the year, in mid-July, there was a turn date, and you'll notice that around the same time, the stock market appears to have made at least a temporary peak. As far as the rest of the year, in October, we have another turn. This is a pretty sharp turn. And towards the end of the year, depending upon how much weight you put in this, and this, we could have 1, 2, 3 more turn dates. But what I would say is the two dates for the year 2014 appear to be working pretty well so far. So let's look at what else we have. So for the 2014 page, this right here provides a brief description about what the Siderograph looks like so far for this year. If you click on this right here, this link, you can download for yourself a copy of the Donald Bradley Siderograph guide. So this right here goes over some basics, such as, what is the Siderograph? What is it not? It provides some additional context to these turning dates. This guide also provides some good background information. For example, we talk about how turning points in the Siderograph are only intended to indicate turning points in the stock market, but turning points in the Siderograph can be both bottoms and tops. It also talks about how, in addition to looking at just the plain Bradley Siderograph, you can take things farther by looking at different components. And this one talks about how for the mid-July turn date, all three components of the Siderograph make a turn. So let's take a look at that. What are the other component elements? If you go around the internet, you'll pretty much see a Bradley Siderograph that looks like this. Occasionally you'll see heliocentric, which is from the perspective of the sun, but this is the main one that you would see. And the two are somewhat similar. For the Bradley Siderograph website, we have the standard one that you'll see elsewhere on the internet. We also have a zoomed in version. This just provides a better context. So back to what we were talking about before, the component elements. So the Siderograph, it's composed of 3 different elements. The first one is middle terms, second one is long terms, and the third one is declinations. So the middle terms and long terms are simply planetary aspects, and declinations represent where Mercury and Venus are relative to the Earth as far as up and down. If you look at the overall Siderograph, you'll see that it tends to, for this year, top out in the middle of the year. And you'll see that the declinations have a similar pattern. But if you look at the other component elements, you'll see that the middle terms, they have their own turn dates, and the long terms have their own turn dates. If you're interested in learning more about these terms, I definitely would recommend that you watch some of our other videos on YouTube that provide a description of this. And another great place to look at it is if you go to the overview, you can click on major planetary aspects. This would talk about the middle terms and long terms. and you can go to the formula to find out how the Bradley Siderograph formula is calculated, and you can also learn about declinations. So if you're interested in learning more about what they are, that's where you can go to find it. So in that PDF file that we just looked at, we talked about how in addition to the Bradley Siderograph turning on July the 17th, you also have the declinations turning pretty close to that date on July 23rd. Around the same time, you have the long terms making a top. So for this whole period here, the long terms are making a top, as well as the middle terms. This seems to be a little bit more volatile, but that appears to be making a top as well. So if you see things like that, that could potentially indicate that it might be a more significant change. So let's go back. Let's see what impact these turns have had. So for the February turn date that we talked about earlier, you'll see that the declinations, they had a top in early February at the same time the stock market bottomed. At the same time, there was a turn in the middle terms. And you could say that the long terms also had a bottom at that time as well. So what this is intended to do is to provide you some additional data points. So instead of just looking at what you can see as the overall Siderograph, if you're interested, you can actually look at it on a more granular level and see, which things do you think make more sense. For example, if you find that the declinations appear to be a pretty good indicator, you can focus more on that as compared to the overall Siderograph. So if you go down a little bit farther, you'll see the positive and negative underlying elements. So what is this? So if you saw above, we have the planetary aspects that are middle terms and long terms. They can be positive or negative. Positive makes the Siderograph go up, and negative makes it go down. So what this shows is the values for the overall positives. You'll see that the positives top around the end of May, early June, and again around mid-July. And you'll see that the overall negatives, they top around the same time that the Siderograph tops. So if you look at this, you'll see that in the past, for example, around February the 7th, the last Bradley Siderograph turn date, the S&P 500 bottomed. The positives were relatively flat, and the negatives had a little top. And you can just see here every time that the positives and the negatives make a turn. So you'll see right here, for example, there's a near-term top in the positives, and there's a near-term top in the stock market. Right here, you'll see that there is a at least temporary top in the S&P 500, which corresponded to a top in the overall Siderograph. The green is the overall, and the negatives, as well as the positives. So that PDF file that we looked at earlier was talking about how because not just the Siderograph, but also the positive terms and negative terms were also making turns at that date, it could be a more significant turn date. But it's really up to you where you want to place your emphasis, and you can look at historical numbers to get a sense for that. So if you go to this menu here, you can see what the Siderograph looks like for prior years. For the year 2011, there's a pretty interesting correlation between when the Bitcoins turn and when the Siderograph turns. So if you're interested in historical numbers, you can go here. Going further, you can see the positive aspects and negative aspects broken out even further. So if you're interested in actually downloading the data and playing with this yourself, you can download some free data on the website. So if you go over here to the downloads and store part of the website, you can see data that you can download for free. There's the classical version of the Siderograph, and there's also the deluxe version of the Siderograph. So the classic version includes both the regular Siderograph values as well as the middle terms, long terms, and declinations. If you go over here, you'll see that the deluxe version includes all of these additional items. This way you can customize it to what you're interested in. So if you, based on looking at historical data, you think that a particular aspect, for example, long-term positive aspects or declinations that are positive, have a strong impact in correlation with respect to the security that you're looking at, you can take a look at it and you can backtest it yourself to get a sense for, how well has it worked in the past. At the bottom here, we also have security data that you can download. And last but not least, please leave a comment. We're interested in hearing from you.